A new report from former Biden administration staffers has been making headlines as the authors hope the next pro clean energy administration will learn critical lessons. The report is called Implementation of Federal Clean Energy Programs Lessons Learned from DOE and Partner Agencies. Today, we're excited to have one of the report's authors, Louise White, with us to discuss their findings. Louise, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, your background. What was your role in the Biden administration? How did that experience lead you and your co-authors to write this report on implementation?
Yes, definitely. So I joined the Department of Energy in middle of 2023, in July 2023, coming after business school and trying to figure out what to do and feeling really inspired. IRA had recently passed, bill was underway. Very excited about what the Biden administration was doing, the people that they had been bringing in, and the kind of overall ambition of the bill and IRA programs and policies. So wanted to be part of the team to help implement. So joined DOE, supporting the Loan Programs Office and what was then called Office of Technology Transitions, now Office of Technology Commercialization, in 2023, particularly focused on kind of commercializing grid technologies and modernizing and expanding the grid was my main scope of work. And my two other co-authors, Ramsey Foss and Alan Propp, also, I think, similarly motivated kind of by the ambition for what the Biden administration was trying to do on clean energy. Ramsey worked at LPO and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and Alan at LPO as well. And what led us to kind of work on this was earlier this year in 2025, when the Trump administration had just come in. Dramatic changes were very quickly starting to happen across the federal government, with many people who were involved in implementing Bill and IRA leaving, whether by choice or because of the new administration. And I think we recognized that there was this kind of opportunity to capture lessons learned from what we had all been through over the last couple of years of what does it take to implement these types of big demonstration and deployment programs, which had been, somewhat new at that scale for the DOE and for the federal government writ large, for at least this time period. And I think initial motivation was very much just to understand what worked and what didn't with implementation. And I think that has become even more cogent and important over the last several months as we've seen a lot of these programs dismantled and the shape of the federal government looks very different today. I think we didn't want to lose all of the good work and the ideas and I think the lessons for how we can do this type and scale of programs even bigger and better, hopefully in the future.
Yeah. So the report concludes that, quote, the machinery of government defaulted to caution in process. The report also underscored how the shadow of Solyndra hung over decision-making. It contributed to even more cautious and risk-averse approaches. What did that look like from the inside, and how can a future administration overcome that instinct?
So I think one note just to like set a little bit of the backdrop here is that this type of risk aversion is not unique to DOE or to the Biden administration. It is a very kind of well documented and understood issue across all of federal government and government writ large, of this kind of culture and process that rewards processes and compliance over actually delivering outcomes. And so that's kind of a broader issue that I think is getting a lot of recognition today within the federal government. But certainly I think that was alive and well at the DOE. So that kind of this culture of risk aversion and this idea of making sure that we didn't have another Solyndra came up in a lot of interviews. And I think was particularly important because, like I said, this was the first time that DOE was, in charge of implementing these types and scale of administration and deployment programs. And I think there was this concern that if there was some sort of failure or something that could kind of set back the entire agenda. And so there was, this concern for kind of Solyndra type issue. And so what that looked like tactically meant that there was a lot of diligence of each and every project and, a lot of briefings and analysis and digging into each program and award before, anything was able to be moved forward. And so it really slowed down decision-making, kind of lengthened out award processes in ways kind of in the name of risk aversion, but what resulted was just stretching out timelines significantly. Though I will say, kind of interestingly, Solyndra was an LPO loan many years ago, but the folks at LPO actually mentioned Solyndra far less than kind of other folks in the administration and in the White House. And I think this was largely, and at least from my experience at LPO, partly due to the kind of leadership's focus at LPO on kind of tackling the idea of what is an appropriate level of risk for government to be taking head on. So there was a big intentional focus from leadership on kind of normalizing the idea that, not every loan might be, not going to play out exactly as we think it is. And there will be some things that we, are, I won't say failures, because I think you can always learn from something that doesn't work. But this kind of intentional focus on normalizing risk in a way that I think actually had a big impact on the office. And it came out in interviews where folks kind of didn't bring this up as much as we heard in other areas. And I think we were starting to see some of that in other offices, in OSED, OTT, and others, to try to help kind of shift this bias towards risk aversion. But it came, later in the administration, and wasn't able to kind of impact our decisions and processes, versus if we, I think, come in with a clearer view of what is the government's approach to kind of risk taking when we're building out these Bill and IRA programs. I think could have shifted culture and processes and decisions along the way.
It's really fascinating to hear you say that about LPO. And I mean, Jigar Shah has been very transparent in how he and his team approached these loans, and also noting the deep due diligence that they would do for everyone that they gave a single penny to. But you mentioned these interviews, and I'm just curious, from your own process in doing the report, was it difficult to get people to speak with you? How did that process work?
Yeah, so we were reaching out to, we were mostly focused on DOE, but also talked to some folks kind of at other agencies in the White House involved in kind of these clean energy programs. I would say most folks were happy to connect. I think we all, we're in the trenches together. I think we were particularly focused on kind of talking to folks. We would talk to folks on all kind of seniority levels, but in particular, folks who were on the kind of day-to-day staffing levels, who were seeing these programs day in and day out, and kind of involved in like the nitty-gritty of these programs. And I think, a lot of folks had reflections and ideas, both in what they wish they might have done differently, or what they would want to see next time, or things that worked really well that they didn't want to lose. And so, we had I think generally folks were excited to talk. Everything was conducted on background, so we don't attribute to any particular folks in the report. But I think that in itself was really encouraging, and personally, it was really I think valuable process to go through, to hear how this kind of, I think one of my big takeaways is that federal government can be such a force for good, and we have a lot of the ideas and solutions for how to do implementation more effectively and efficiently. So it's not like it's an unsolvable problem. We just need to figure out how to actually to put it into practice. And so I think interviews kind of consistently held that theme alive.
Could you kind of detail what that balance looks like in terms of due diligence and also speed to get the outcomes? What were folks saying in these interviews was the right balance there?
Mm-hmm. So they looked maybe a little bit different at for different programs, different types. If it's a deployment focused effort versus something that's very technically risky and not proven. And so I think flavors need to be appropriate to the sector technology of interest. But in general, I think the places where folks highlighted as over diligence was in some of the kind of maybe compliance driven elements, or I think there was, one of the things that we were learning at LPO was that every time we were seeing a new project, we were approaching it all the same way at the beginning. So every project got the same amount of commercial diligence as well as technical diligence, which is not true. Every project was a little bit different. Some projects were, very technically proven. You didn't need to do very much of a technical diligence, and it was much more about the commercial, versus others that was, the other way around. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea kind of what's the appropriate level of diligence is making sure you're kind of tailoring it to the specific project. So you're actually addressing the real issues and concerns versus just assuming you need to like look at the full scope every single time for everything, which I think was that kind of like exhaustive view that really slowed a lot of things down. And so when we started, at least at LPO, started being more tailored and specific with our approach, that was where we started to see our diligence timelines come down significantly. And I think the other kind of broader piece that was coming up in a lot of interviews, and we talk a lot about in the second half of the report of kind of ideas for what an executive branch can do, is also thinking creatively about kind of program designs and how you're developing the programs from the get-go. So the traditional model that DOE was using for a lot of these big grant programs was something called cooperative agreements. We don't need to get into the details, but effectively kind of a grant that comes with a lot of strings, a lot of monitoring, a lot of reporting, and kind of a lot of administrative burdens that make those really complicated to get out the door, versus other models that have been used at smaller scale and in other contexts, but we didn't lean into as much at DOE, of these kind of pay for outcomes approaches, or this kind of category of other transactions authorities that can let you do, demand offtake instead of just a kind of construction grant program, and other pieces that I think is relevant for this question because they can be easier to administer and easier to implement, and also more aligned with the outcomes you're actually trying to achieve. So for, pay for outcomes kind of prize models that DOE has used, you don't need to do as much diligence because you can see very clearly at the end of, has the outcome been achieved? Yes, no. If yes, then the money goes out the door. If no, then it doesn't. And so there's these kind of other creative ways to help kind of mitigate the amount of upfront kind of diligence and upfront processes while still getting to the same outcome and still holding the programs to account.
The report also warns that many programs try to meet too many goals at once. And I would think this includes the Justice 40 initiative and equity being a big part of these programs, labor standards, the list goes on. How should future administrations decide what not to take on or to focus these on outcomes? And what's the right balance between achieving that, but also being mindful of the fact that inevitably there's a variety of interests in any, we'll say, Democratic coalition for any president that is elected into the White House?
Yeah, definitely. And I won't pretend to have the perfect answer here. And I think maybe one piece there that we heard consistently in interviews is, there were a lot of priorities, and there's good reason for that. All of these issues are very important for different reasons. But I think the challenge that we kind of kept running into and what we heard from folks was that every program, every project had to be a win-win across all of those pieces. And that was where it just became, unrealistic at times for, a transmission project to have the same kind of job impact as a, manufacturing plant that was coming in. But it was, I think, this idea of every program needing to be a win-win, which is where our opportunity is to focus a bit more. And so I think in my mind, and I think one idea there is to figure out how to let any specific project or program have, one or two kind of non-negotiable, like, here's what success means and like what the program is supposed to be doing. And then making sure that across your entire portfolio of any administration's agenda, you are advancing all of those priorities, but letting each individual program or project not have to kind of bear that weight. And so I think there's a opportunity to be a little bit more kind of holistic in thinking about how we're, achieving all these priorities, but in different areas, and recognizing that, sometimes we have win-win-wins, but oftentimes there is some sort of trade-off, and let's make sure we're, thoughtful, but enabling the trade-off decision to be made so that these programs can move forward.
You point to Project 2025 and the Trump administration's approach as examples of rigorous pre-planning. What can a future administration that supports clean energy and deployment learn from these models, even if the goals are different?
Yes, I'm going to set the specifics of Project 2025 aside, but I think the importance of that, the element that we call for a lot in the report too, is just this idea of planning for implementation before day one. That it's not just about the big policy ideas, but it is thinking very thoughtfully of how are the agencies going to be run, how are these programs and policy ideas actually going to be implemented, that I think any future Democratic administration can and should be thinking about today, and not waiting until the transition or day one when it is far too late to do the type of kind of measured implementation planning and thought. And so I think figuring out how to start supporting that implementation capacity building and development early is critical alongside any kind of policy agenda and policy development.
Yeah. And final question, if there's just one takeaway or anything maybe that we haven't talked about yet that you want to leave folks with, what is it?
It's kind of hard to, I think, hard for myself to imagine this a little bit right now, but this process has left me more inspired than ever about the opportunity and ability for government to do big, bold, ambitious programs. And I think we were starting to do a lot of that under the last administration. We're starting to see a lot of big investments and projects moving forward. And it's certainly while disappointing to see some of the backtracking over the last couple of months, I think I feel more inspired than ever that we have a lot of the ideas and solutions and authorities available to us today to come back and continue to think about kind of bold clean energy policy and industrial strategy programs and be able to implement them even better next time.
Louise White, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chris.